this wonderful starting point, which I think touches the very roots of how big data relates to core meta-body issues. And I will in fact take on from where we have been exchanging a little bit before the conference, so that I could take on a little bit from where Kevin is leaving, and I would like to enter broad ontological landscapes regarding big data, because I think an enormous task still needs to be done in order to understand what is at stake. I think that big data defies most of the discursive apparatuses we have so far. It enters really territories which we still need to account for. So I will pose very broad questions that we can hopefully deal with all together. So big data is meta-body, big data is a body, first of all. I want to demystify this idea of the dematerialization of the cloud. The cloud, as some have already said, is perhaps the most mischieving metaphor that has ever been invented. The cloud is a heavy industrial meta-body of millions of data centers, with billions of hard drives, with billions of cables, of devices sending wireless information, of submarine cables, of satellites, of these huge industrial centers, secret centers of the data centers. This is the one in Utah, being built in Utah, which is the second largest, the largest being built in China at the moment. These several million data centers in the world consume more than 200% of the whole electricity of the planet. So when we say the cloud, this is all part of the cloud. It's just part, because the cloud is even much more than that. The cloud is every single device that connects us, every single sensor. We are immersed, we are literally swimming in billions of sensors that are all around us, from the sky and the planets to every single little device that we wear. Every smartphone has more than 12 different sensors, not to speak of the very screen interface, which is itself a very complex sensor. And more we are going towards the miniaturization of the sensors, how they become embedded in our clothes, in our skin. And of course, the next step is in the nanotechnological scale of having nanorobots inside our blood that are connected to the internet. The drone paradigm, of course, is a very important aspect of how the vision of the big data eye is expanding in a very novel paradigm, a novel kind of movement, a novel kind of vision. Now, this is from Cisco Systems. I'm bringing this here because just to give an idea of the scale of the Internet of Things, of how big data is expanding, there is this Internet protocol called where is this here? IPv6, with almost a septillion of possible Internet addresses, which means for every atom of the Earth one could have 100 Internet addresses. That's where the Internet of Things is already looking towards. So nanotechnological devices, nanorobots in your blood that are all connected to the Internet. This is the vision at the moment. We're still a little bit far from it, but this is where it's going to, at least. So this is from a presentation of Cisco Systems of the project of Planetary Skin. The Planetary Skin Institute wants to place billions of sensors over the whole skin of the planet. Of course, presumably with a good intention of preventing catastrophes of the climate or such things, but we don't absolutely know what other goals this might have. Cisco Systems is one of the major corporations dealing with big data at the moment. Now, one of the major problems that we have to, if we want to have a global approach to big data, is how has it become desirable? What kind of effective contagion has made big data a desirable kind of paradigm, which is the big shift from the Orwellian totalitarian state. Now control is a desirable, it's almost a shared economic issue, a shared economy issue. Well, this kind of gesture, this kind of gesture that reminds us of the gesture of the selfie, for instance, this is what I would call the mode of affective contagion that makes continuously this control desirable, so that you have this smiles, this never-ending smiles connected to this idea of technology that gives you a certain class status. There's a whole issue there about coloniality, neocolonialism, and so on and so forth. So this is a crucial aspect. We must understand how is it that these unprecedented control systems, rather than appearing as totalitarian structures, have become utterly desirable, also with this kind of aura of inevitability, of course. Oh, sorry, this is Spanish. Yeah, well, how is the implicit and explicit acceptance of data protection or disprotection measures? How does it proliferate through this what I call the contagious gestural economy of the click? We're all the time clicking and clicking and clicking in the internet. You click yes several times a day to contracts that are several hundred pages long, if you would read, and nobody reads them, and with which we are actually giving our data forever and any time and anywhere in the universe. This is sometimes being written in these contracts for purposes we don't know. So it's impossible actually to know the purpose of data processing, because data processing is a procedural issue. And this is something I will deal with soon in the presentation. Now, the issue of big data is not just an issue of privacy. I think it's misleading to just focus on an issue of privacy. That's just a superficial kind of aspect of the more crude ontological questions that this raises. The predictive paradigm of big data, which attempts to predict our behaviors in modes such as Kevin was presenting to us, is actually a preemptive paradigm. It means it's an anticipatory paradigm. It is actually producing the reality it tries to anticipate in advance. What this means is that the very feedback processes of the interfaces we use that are not only sensing how we move and trying to predict our future movements, are also channeling more and more of these movements. We have to move along the narrow bandwidth of the interface, from the actual physical bandwidth of how the mouse works, how the keyboard works, instead of how this gesture works, to how the whole algorithms of the interfaces are choreographing our thinking, for example. So there's a productive modulation of our behaviors going on there. So it's not just about tracing and controlling and knowing, it's about a huge homogenization process in which our patterns of movement and behavior are being modulated by this whole very complex feedback system. So it's a productive power that's going on there. It's going far beyond the issue of privacy. Another big issue is that, well, as what's the role of the private or even of the public and the commons in the world of big data? Does it exist still, would I ask? I believe that the paradigm of the division between a private and a public space comes from a disciplinary society, as Foucault would have described, which means a society made of enclosures in which you open a door or you close it. You close the door, you are inside your private chamber, your room, you open the door and you go into this other public sphere. Now, this is not the way the digital operates. The movements of the digital codes are about cryptography. So there's nothing there about intimacy or public space. I believe that public space has disappeared just as much as intimacy or privacy disappeared as a paradigm. This is an obsolete paradigm from the 19th century, fundamentally, from the early 20th century. The codes, the movement of the digital codes just don't operate along those lines. So, for instance, many of you might be shocked to know that Facebook records and traces and analyzes every single thing you type, every draft that you type, even if you don't publish it. So, of course, this is a way in which corporations are instrumentalizing the way we still believe in these old models of space, of public and private space. We still think that because we are in our room and we are typing, but until we click on publish, still what's going on is private, and this is not so. That doesn't exist anymore. So the codes are not respecting those boundaries that we still believe. Those are obsolete beliefs from an earlier kind of culture, which big data is instrumentalizing in terms of, okay, they are able to trace unconscious, like also Kevin was presenting us how DARPA is trying to analyze unconscious movements that you do with your smartphone to generate a unique profile of you. Also, Facebook is tracing your drafts, which are like unconscious drafts that you then decide not to publish. So they defend this very questionable idea of a transparent society, while of course Facebook or Google are absolutely not transparent. They are absolutely opaque corporations. So that already says a lot about the kinds of intentions that their discourses on transparency might conceal. One of the crucial issues, as you may know, the European laws of data protection are possibly the strongest in the world, and yet I think they are completely obsolete with regard to what big data represents and implies. For example, the data protection laws in Europe demand that one must be able to know the finality, the goal of the data processing. So when you say yes without reading to the contract that you give to Facebook forever, your data, one should in principle know what that data is given for. What is the purpose of that? Well, that per se is impossible, because precisely big data, being a new revolution of the history of information, already from the beginning, cybernetics and information are per se procedural. It's an ever-emerging process. That's what cybernetics implants as a completely new paradigm of power. So one could say that until the middle of the 20th century, we still had the model of disciplinary power, as Foucault would say, in which one could see power operating in terms of attempting to repeat existing patterns of behavior. Whereas cybernetics introduces a completely new mode of power, which is a modulating network that is sensing the emergent movements and is modulating along those emergencies and trying to then further anticipate or preempt the emergent behaviors. So it's a completely new paradigm, which is procedural. I sometimes define this shift, this ontological shift of power, as going from a Platonic paradigm of eternal forms, say disciplinary society as attempting to reproduce eternal forms, to an Aristotelian ontology of power in which it's all about emergent formations. It's emergent morphogenesis of relations of power and so on. So current legal paradigms, which we have inherited from Roman law, so it's not even from the 18th century, it's 2,000 years old, paradigm of how legal systems operate in relation to property, for example, I think are absolutely obsolete in relation to how big data operates. It's absurd to pretend to know the finality or the goal of data processing when data processing itself is an emergent process without a given finality. So it's impossible to sign a contract in which you know the goal of the data processing. So what I mean is that these very advanced, apparently advanced laws of data protection that focus so much on the issue of privacy and so on are actually just playing on the surface of a much deeper problem that that particular legal system is incapable of dealing with. We need to redefine legal ontology from its foundations because of this revolution that has happened in power formations at the middle of the 20th century, when cybernetics, defined by Wiener, when information, mathematical theory of information, as defined by Claude Shannon, proposes a novel ontology which is completely procedural. So this is just one example. It's a huge scenario that opens up. Now, another interesting aspect that needs to be accounted for is the new models of governmentality that models such as Facebook are providing. As you may know, well, I speak of Facebook as a new post-Orwellian model of more than a totalitarian meta-state. Well, as you may know, Facebook has surpassed China in population in April of 2015. I speak of Facebook population. I'm thinking of Facebook as a meta-state, right? Now, I also think, and of course this would have to be researched more in depth, but I also, so far, sense that the degree of intrusion and of capacity of modulation of its citizens is larger and deeper in Facebook than in the Chinese government. This is perhaps a provocation. We need to research this in depth, but let's think about this, right? How is Facebook operating as a new mode of governmentality that is even more totalitarianly intrusive, but very differently from a kind of state government or state model? How is that operating? How is it so desirable? How deep does it go in trying to preempt your non-conscious desires through tracing your drafts when you write or when you click on the I like it icon, even when you are not inside Facebook and you're still being traced by Facebook. So all your digital prints, even outside of the network, are part of this profiling of people and of populations. Well, it's a completely novel kind of paradigm, although it has very long histories, but I think it's introducing a very revolutionary term, and a very problematic one. Yeah, this is how they think of it, of course. In Silicon Valley, they have this visionary and messianic kind of ideal that they want to change the world, this very paternalistic attitude. They want to make our lives better. They know how to make our lives better. As you may know, Uber comes apparently from Übermensch, right? From Uber, this company which has such an aggressive marketing for trying to impose their capturing of the data of flows of circulation in the cities. Their name comes from the Übermensch of Nietzsche. So they believe that they are this superior human, right? And you have this Singularity University in Silicon Valley where they're also speaking in similar terms. So, I'm just pinpointing some very general aspects, right? Another important aspect is how is global fear engineered in the what I would call hyper-effective hyper-capital. This is a very important aspect because when people speak about the need for security, this is takes for granted that fear is a universal kind of emotion, which I question. In any case, I think fear and terror is engineered differently in different contexts. And what we have now is a multi-scale engineering of fear from the atomic bomb in the middle of the 19th century, which is precisely when information emerges in the middle of a conception of the world as unpredictable, so when the Newtonian vision of the world as predictable falls down in the 20th century, you have then people like Wiener and Shannon trying to develop a new mode of prediction of this unpredictability, which emerges together with the atomic bomb, with this novel, unprecedented threat of annihilation. Together with the birth of the PC, which was again Apple, you have the AIDS crisis, which is another, which is still pervading layer of global fear. I mean, in between there are many other things, but just pointing out some of them. And from the 2000s, we have this new global war against terrorism, global terror, which is together also with cyber terror issues, and which has emerged together with this new revolution, that is where big data comes in, which has to do with the birth of ubiquitous computation in the cloud, which is again Apple. Apple, through the clever invention of this design object, has facilitated the fact that everyone is connected everywhere at any time, or almost, so that the cloud is born. And of course, you can't have all the software here, so therefore you need, of course, to have the software up in the cloud. Up in the cloud means in these data centers, these 2 million industrial centers that are hidden in different places. So the engineering of fear, especially since 9/11, the World Trade Center terror act, has had a novel evolution which now, even with the Islamic State, is taken even further in terms of any of us could become, apparently, jihadists. Therefore, all the more, there's a need, apparently, to have each of us scrutinized for potential behaviors, for emergent potential patterns of movement and behavior, whether how you move your smartphone or how you browse through your website, that could make you into a potential future terrorist or a potential consumer. So both elements, the commercial and the state protection, so to speak, the security issue, are working along this also novel paradigm of the virtual. It's no longer about the actual, what you are now, but what could you be? What could you be what potential terrorists could emerge? What potential, especially what potential consumer could emerge? What would be your potential emergent desire? Because desires are emergent, they are not just fully predictable. So, this raises enormous issues. Now, I want to provoke you with the idea that we are all effective and sexual workers of new hypercapital in terms of how our activities, our relationalities, our exchanges are mediated by interfaces that trace capture our movements, and therefore they are implicitly capitalized. We can speak about this if you want it's interesting that recently the Spanish ministry has recognized that the people working for Uber are workers, with full status workers. This is an interesting point, because the corporation claims that they're just people making a service, or they don't have the status of a worker. I would say that people using Facebook are workers for Facebook. They are giving their whole life's data. They are being digitalized intensively. And the corporation is extracting an immediate value of that through publicity, but also an infinite potential value through the emergent algorithms of future optimized tracing or processing of those data. So the next ontological question is the question of what is data. Can we localize data? Like, for example, in the project we use data analysis of movement. We can use raw data coming from a sensor, which is already questionable what the sensor gives you, but then there are high-level features you can extract from that. If you record just the high-level features, well, where is the data? Was it in the raw data or in the high-level features you extract from it? If you then just keep some of those features, but then you process them further, you generate a new kind of metadata or data out of that. So the data is not an objective kind of existing reality, it's a mode of perception, it's how you fix a part of a reality in a particular way, in a particular context. It's impossible to ontologically fix what data is. And so this is another difficulty in dealing with this whole situation. Data as an emergent process is not possible to localize. Now, another important question is this disappearing. I already mentioned disappearing of the public and of the private, but also the disappearing of the commons. How far is Airbnb and Uber a mode of intensive capitalization of the share, what we call shared economy, as a capitalization of generosity, for example? How does it make increasingly impossible to have a sharing that is not being capitalized, for example? So how is that making the commons impossible in a way? How is the disappearing of the commons an effect of how big data operates? Of course, many people would complain here, maybe not you, but saying, oh no, but big data is all about the commons. Well, that's very questionable. Because even if the data were stored in public servers, which of course is absolutely not the case, it's all super secret infrastructures, even then, who has the power for processing those data? Like Google or Facebook spend billions of dollars in generating the most sophisticated algorithms for storing the data. What do I do with, even if I would have access to all the servers in the world, all these 2 million data centers, what can I do with that information? So it's the processing that's really the relevant issue, and what do you do with that? So it's a priori, it's something that doesn't afford, I think, a discourse of the commons. So there's something ontological in the technology that is going against what some claim as the possibility for having an open or a commons of data. At least I think we need to take much further the discussion. Okay, and to finish, I think that we need to deepen in the perceptual genealogy of data. What makes data possible? I think data is a perceptual fiction. So data is about discretizing movement and making it measurable. So that's where the body again comes in. And so that's why also Kevin's description of the DARPA project was so important as a starting point here. Because it's showing us how more and more big data strategies are about sophisticated modes of analysis of movement, behavior, emotion, all related. So now unconscious movement you build with your smartphone like this. That's one of the major aspects of investigation in big data. Now how does that happen? Because it's all about reducing the complexity of movement, the body as movement, reduced to calculable items, to calculable elements. Well, the interface itself is the capturing element, the capturing moment, where your movement is boiled down to a narrow bandwidth in which it can be measured. This is a very long history. From the birth of geometry, and I have mentioned this in previous presentations, to a crucial moment in the Renaissance with the birth of perspective. The perspectival window is where vision starts to really become the dominant paradigm, whereas in Greece still some more haptic elements were important in perception, I think, even in Euclidean geometry. In Renaissance is where vision and the rationalization of vision becomes the absolutely dominant paradigm. Now this is what we still have here. We're still embedded in that paradigm, but much more complicated. Right? Even when we have haptic sensors, they are operating along that paradigm of measurement and fixation through vision. Now the camera, of course, the important thing about the camera is that it is also reproducing that paradigm. We can use cameras in very different ways, but the camera emerged within the paradigm of perspective, and because it is used in the perspectival mode, it is reproducing the kinds of distances and fixations of perception that allow one to believe that you are a subject, that you are outside the world, that you can therefore measure the world, that you can therefore measure also the movements of another body. So I'm interested in meta-bodies much. It's a lot about investigating how is that particular very anomalous but very dominant perceptual regime articulated, and how can we reinvent it radically, like we are literally inventing other modalities of perception which are not about this hierarchy of fixation of vision. You see this long history that goes from the Greek theater to the smartphone, which is reproducing this particular perceptual alignment that now involves biometric devices. Well, biometrics, of course, has again how it reduces the complexity of micro movements of the body to a number of skeletal points that can be measured and traced. This reductive approach has a long history of biologization in biopolitics since the 18th century, precisely when the authoritative regimes of the sovereign societies fall down with the French Revolution, and you have, well, a new paradigm of control, a paradigm of power, what was the disciplinary society emerges together with the capacity to trace the body as a biological entity, to measure its behaviors, to start developing endless profiles, medical profiles, criminal profiles, and so on and so forth. Big data is taking that much, much further. For instance, data protection laws prevent that the state crosses different databases, like your social security and your tax database. In Spain, they cannot be crossed because the data protection prevents it. But big data is doing precisely the contrary. It's all about crossing databases all the time. So biometrics and state racism have a very long history, precisely as the novel paradigm of slightly more invisible control that emerges when this novel democratic, apparently democratic regime emerged after the French Revolution in the middle of the industrial era. So one could say that biopolitics, biometrics, and biologization of the body replaces authoritative regimes in terms of mode of social articulation and control. And now, of course, we are in a much more revolutionary turn because of the procedural aspect of big data. So I believe there's a radical obsolescence of politics and legal systems in relation to how all this is operating. Metabody is supposed to generate, it's expected to generate a Tecnoethics white book, so there are many topics I hope we can discuss here. The ontological status of the media infrastructure, the perceptual models, the modes of embodiment, the new processual ontologies of data. This is just to mention a few. I will propose more topics. So my approach is, how can we, instead of talking about private and public and defend the private versus the public, or trying to generate again a public space which has already disappeared behind the choreography of a selfie, how can we think of space, body, embodiment, movement in terms of degrees of indeterminacy? How can we generate larger degrees of indeterminacy within environments that are highly codified, that are operating on a logic of prediction and preemption? So that's where in Metabody I ask the question, how can we become illegible to big data rather than just assuming that that is there? Well, I don't assume it. How can my gesture, instead of assuming that DARPA will be able to automatically register my profile, my identity, in terms of my unconscious movements, how can I rework through my whole conscious, non-conscious spectrum of movement in terms of developing emergent behaviors that escape this constant prediction and preemption of behavior and movement? This is one of the big topics that we want to deal with and experiment very bodily in Metabody, from doing movement exercises to interactive architectures and so on and so forth. So you will see, for example, we have an application going on in Media Lab, in this immersive installations that you're invited to see from tomorrow onwards. One of them is called Illegible Affects, and you will see how we try there to raise an awareness of a positive awareness of the indeterminacy, ambiguity of your gesture, for instance, rather than focus, as most corporations do, on trying to predict and homogenize your patterns of behavior. So thank you very much. I think I went over time as usual, and since we don't have Karen now, which I would like to take the opportunity to send her a big hug, since she has had this death in her family which prevented her from coming. Just send her from all of us our considerations, and if you agree, we could of course open it out on what Kevin and myself just proposed to you, but also connecting it to interaction. What is interaction? Maybe some of you don't know what this concept means. We could try to introduce it in the general discussion. This is Karen Barratt's proposal, which I have tried to embed in Metabody very deeply. We are talking all the time about interaction rather than interaction. But I think we can leave this now for the debate, if you want.